I still remember that Monday morning clearly, not because it was unusual, but because it was exactly like hundreds of Mondays before it. The start of the week, the start of a new financial quarter, the kind of time when people remind each other that focus matters and that important decisions are about to be made. I arrived at headquarters earlier than usual. Outside, a light rain was falling, not heavy enough to be annoying, but just enough to dull the sky and make the air feel heavier. The main conference room of the regional healthcare system was on the third floor. The space was so familiar I could have found my way around it with my eyes closed. Long tables that had been there for years, their surfaces marked with small scratches no one bothered to fix. Fluorescent lights overhead cast an even white glow, not warm, not harsh, just there. The coffee in my cup had already gone cold by the time I sat down, and I still took a small sip out of habit as a way of marking that the workday had officially begun. The people around the table were all familiar faces: project managers, representatives from regional clinics, and a few senior doctors were invited because they were directly tied to the modernization program. We greeted each other with brief nods, no small talk. Some meetings are attended with anticipation, not to debate, but simply to see what will be decided. I had a clear sense that this morning was one of those meetings. The new CEO entered the room right on time. He had only been in the role for a few months and still carried the posture of someone eager to make his mark. His suit was neatly pressed, his tie carefully set. He placed a thin folder on the table, glanced around the room, and smiled, as if searching for agreement before he even began. He talked about the new quarter, about financial challenges, and about the need for the system to be more flexible under tighter budgets. The words he used were familiar to me: restructuring, optimization, efficiency. Then he said that to adapt to these changes, the organization needed new perspectives, fresh eyes, so it would not get stuck in old patterns. I listened, my hand resting on my notebook, but I did not write anything. I had heard those phrases for more than 20 years, and they rarely produced real change on their own. After the opening remarks, he moved to the main topic: the Rural Clinic Modernization Project, the largest initiative we had worked on for years. He emphasized its importance, spoke about timeline pressure, and about expectations from the board and donors. His voice was steady, with no hint that anything unusual was coming. Then he paused, just long enough for the room to focus. He said that to push the project into its next phase more forcefully, leadership had decided to assign a new person to lead it. He introduced his son, recently graduated, a background in data analytics. Someone was expected to bring new energy to the project. In that moment, the room fell silent. Not an uncomfortable silence, but a polite one, stretched just a bit longer than normal. I felt a few glances turn toward me, then away again. No one objected openly. I understood why. This was the CEO. The decision had clearly been prepared in advance, and pushing back in that moment would only make things awkward. An older doctor sitting across from me shifted slightly, as if he might speak, then stopped. He looked at me briefly, his expression a mix of apology and helplessness, before turning away. The CEO continued, explaining that I would take on an advisory role during the transition, offering support when needed. He said it gently, as if it were a reasonable arrangement for everyone involved. I nodded lightly, not in agreement, but out of instinct, the reflex of someone who does not want to disrupt the rhythm of a meeting. In my head, the phrase "fresh eyes" echoed again. I thought of late nights in small clinics, emergency calls when equipment was missing, sitting beside hospital beds at 3 in the morning. Fresh eyes had never lived through those moments, but I did not say it out loud. Not then. The meeting ended on time. Papers were gathered, chairs pushed back, and a few familiar, polite exchanges followed. I carried my now completely cold coffee and walked slowly out of the room. Outside, the rain was still falling, no heavier, no lighter. I paused briefly in the hallway, looked through the glass down at the parking lot, then continued back to my office. Before leaving the conference area, I turned back for one last look at the long table. I had sat there on so many Monday mornings, always believing I understood how decisions were made. That morning, I realized that some mistakes do not begin with loud conflict, but with the very polite silence of an entire room. If you are listening to this story from a big city or a small town, from the United States or anywhere else in the world, You can leave a line to let me know where you are. Stories about value, about respect, and about decisions made in rooms like this do not belong to any one country. They happen everywhere, wherever people work together and face choices that change more than they expect. I was not the most noticeable person in that conference room, and I never wanted to be. I was a woman in my 50s, gray beginning to show at my temples, and at a glance, I probably looked like someone more accustomed to standing behind the scenes than sitting at the head of the table. I did not enter community healthcare for titles or ambition. I learned early on that there are roles no one pays attention to, but without them, the entire system simply stops. I had worked in community healthcare infrastructure for more than 20 years. Most of that time was not spent in large buildings or under conference lights, but in small clinics, in towns where people still greet each other by name, and in places where doctors treat patients while quietly worrying whether the system will survive another winter. I grew used to working with older physicians who disliked rapid change, but once they trusted someone, they honored that trust completely. I also grew used to low-income communities, where every decision has real consequences, not on paper, but in the daily lives of people. My job was never easy to describe in a single title. I did not just manage equipment or contracts. I kept things connected. I was the person clinics called when systems failed, when funding was delayed, when a grant condition suddenly changed. I knew who needed to be called first, who had to be persuaded later, and who should never be contacted on a weekend. None of that existed in any handbook, and none of it could be learned in a few months. There were clinics known for being difficult, places that had gone through multiple coordinators over the years, and still struggled until they finally worked steadily with me alone. Not because I had any special authority, but because they knew I told the truth, and when I said I would come back, I did. I understood how state budgets actually moved, the deadlines that seemed meaningless until missing one day froze everything for an entire quarter. I understood funding conditions, the small print many people ignored, and I knew exactly who to call in an emergency to save 2 hours and who not to call if I did not want to lose 2 weeks. Those skills never appeared in annual reports. They did not show up in charts or performance dashboards. They lived in relationships built over time and in the memory of people who knew that someone on the other end of the line would pick up when they called. I did not hold the highest title, but I held the threads that, if cut, would cause many things to fall at once. I remember one on-call night a few years earlier when a remote clinic phoned me close to midnight. They were missing a critical piece of equipment, and without it by morning, they would have to transfer patients hours away. There was no procedure for that situation, no form to fill out. I sat at my kitchen table, phone in the center, and started calling. A supplier who had worked with us before, a warehouse manager in another city, someone I knew would answer even after business hours. In the end, we made it work. The equipment arrived before dawn. No report was written about it. But the next morning, the clinic was still operating. Things like that happen more often than people realize. They are not impressive. They do not translate well into presentations. But they are the reason the system keeps running. I never thought of it as anything special. It was just the job. Over time, though, I understood that those unnamed tasks were the source of my real value to the organization. So when I sat in that conference room on Monday morning, I did not feel personally insulted. I was not angry. What I felt was a clear disconnect between how the system measured value and how value actually existed. I knew I was not easy to replace, not because I could not leave, but because the threads I held could not be handed over with an announcement. They were tied to people, to time, and to trust, things no one can rush into existence. Our CEO was not a bad man, and I think that needs to be said clearly from the beginning. He did not come into the organization intending to tear down what already existed, nor did he look down on the people who had worked here for years. In fact, in the few private conversations we had, I could see that he genuinely wanted things to be better. But that desire came with a very strong belief, and that belief became his biggest blind spot. He was hired at a time when the system was under heavy pressure from the board. Budgets were being cut. Transparency demands were rising. Reports had to look cleaner, faster, and more convincing. The board wanted clear numbers, upward trending charts, and plans that showed the organization was modernizing and not falling behind. The CEO understood that, and he believed the best way to meet those expectations was through data, technology, and modern management models. In the first meetings after he took the role, he talked often about decisions needing to be data-driven. He believed that with enough data and the right analytical tools, personal experience would no longer matter as much as it once did. To him, experience was useful, but hard to measure. Data, on the other hand, was clear, transparent, and easy to present to a board. I understood why he thought that way. In many industries, that belief has produced good results. But community healthcare is not a spreadsheet. His son was the clearest example of that belief in action. He was smart, no one denied that. Recently graduated, well-credentialed, fluent in analytics tools, comfortable talking about processes, models, and performance metrics. On the rare occasions I heard him present, everything sounded clean, logical, and reasonable. He believed that if procedures were followed correctly, if every step was standardized, outcomes would automatically improve. The issue was not that he lacked knowledge, it was that he had never worked directly with real people in imperfect conditions. He had never sat in a small clinic with a broken heater in the middle of winter. He had never listened to an older doctor explain that they did not need more software. They needed someone who understood why their appointment schedule was always running late. So those experiences do not appear in textbooks, and they do not fit neatly into any model. Watching the two of them together, I saw a clear alignment in how they thought. The CEO trusted data. His son trusted the process. Both believed that if the system was designed correctly, people would simply adapt. They were not entirely wrong, but they were missing something critical. In community healthcare, the system does not just serve people, it depends on them. And not everyone adapts as quickly as theoretical models assume. The core conflict between us was never spoken aloud in the conference room, but it was always there. On one side was field experience, built over time, shaped by situations with no predefined solution. On the other hand was a desk-driven mindset, orderly and efficient in theory, but largely untouched by real-world friction. One side trusted what had been tested and proven over many years. The other believed that rapid innovation was the only way to survive. I was never opposed to change. I had seen this system evolve many times, and I knew some things needed to change. But I also knew that tradition in this field was not pointless resistance. It was the result of lessons paid for with time, money, and sometimes human health. When you ignore those lessons in favor of a new model, you are not just risking a project. You are risking the trust of the people who rely on the system every day. What worried me most was not that the CEO's son was given the project, but how that decision was made. It did not come from a deep understanding of the work, but from the belief that newer automatically meant better. There was no real discussion of risks beyond the data, no questions about relationships built over many years. Everything was wrapped in language that sounded convincing. What I saw in that decision was not malice, but overconfidence. The confidence that a system can be controlled from the top down with charts and plans. The confidence that experience can be replaced quickly if there is enough technology. That was the blind spot. And it did not belong to one person alone. It belonged to an entire way of seeing. When I left the conference room that day, I did not think they were doing anything morally wrong. I thought they were underestimating what could not be measured. And in the field I had spent more than 20 years in, the things that cannot be measured are often the very things that keep everything from collapsing. After that Monday morning meeting, nothing changed right away, but I felt a quiet shift almost immediately. There was no sweeping announcement email, no long explanation. Just small details changing, one by one, enough for me to understand that my name was no longer at the center of the decision flow. A few days later, a new meeting invite arrived for the Rural Clinic Modernization Project. I was still included, but my position on the list had changed. Before, my name was always near the top, alongside those carrying primary responsibility. This time, I was labeled as a transition advisor, a phrase that sounded gentle, polite, and very precise. I was no longer the final decision maker. Contract signing authority was moved to someone else. Documents that once required my signature to move forward were now sent to me only for review. I could comment, but I could no longer approve. Calls from other departments began to taper off. Instead, they reached out to the new group, to the people now holding authority. I was not removed from the system, but I was placed in a position where my voice was advisory at best. I did not push back against these changes, not because I agreed with them, but because I understood that resistance at this stage would not alter reality. I continued attending meetings, listening, taking notes, and responding when asked. I stayed professional, as I always had. But internally, something became clear. When you no longer have decision-making authority, you no longer carry real responsibility. And in this field, authority and responsibility are inseparable. One meeting that week focused on rollout progress in a cluster of remote clinics. I sat on the right side of the table, no longer in my usual place. The CEO's son presented the plan, supported by clean charts and clearly defined timelines. On paper, everything made sense. When he finished, the room fell into silence for a few seconds, as it often does before questions begin. An older doctor seated near the window looked toward me. I had worked with him for more than a decade. I recognized that look. He was about to say something, perhaps ask what I thought, or mention a detail only the two of us understood. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He cleared his throat, looked down at his documents, and said nothing. No one else in the room noticed that moment. I did. That silence was not full agreement. It was a reluctant acceptance. Everyone understood that the decision had already been made. They could question small details, but no one wanted to be the person challenging the new structure. In this environment, silence is often treated as cooperation, and cooperation is necessary if you want to keep working. As I sat there, I realized I was witnessing a transition not just of roles, but of how the system functioned. In the past, many decisions were shaped by short conversations, knowing nods, and relationships built over years. Now, everything moved through more formal channels. Meeting minutes became more detailed. Processes became clearer. At the same time, the softer elements that once kept the system flexible were being pushed to the margins. I did not feel personally insulted. No one spoke to me disrespectfully. No one openly dismissed my past contributions. But it was clear that I had been sidelined, not through words, but through structure. And sometimes that is the most effective way to do it. You do not need to diminish someone, you simply stop needing their voice. In the days that followed, decisions were made faster, but they drifted further from reality. A few clinics called me, not to complain, but to ask whether they should keep waiting or start looking for alternatives. I answered carefully. I did not want to cross the boundary of my new role. I did not want to interfere with decisions I no longer owned. Every response was weighed, not just for the organization, but for myself. Being pushed to the margins does not happen in a single moment. It accumulates through small details, an email that no longer includes you, a meeting that no longer seeks your input, a decision announced after it has already been signed. These things do not trigger immediate anger, but they create a clear distance between you and the work you once considered your responsibility. I began to understand that in systems like this, no insult is required to reduce someone's role. You only need to redirect the flow of decisions, and they will naturally stand outside it. No public conflict, no loud arguments, just a polite, collective silence, where people accept a new reality because they see no alternative. And it was within that silence that I realized my role had ended, quietly, without a single word of farewell being spoken. I said nothing more in the meetings that followed, and that was not because I had nothing to say. On the contrary, my head was full of thoughts, questions, and observations that, if spoken aloud, would have made the room uncomfortable. But I had learned long ago that speaking is not always the best way to achieve clarity. Sometimes silence lets you see the structure of a problem more clearly than any argument ever could. I did not argue with the CEO, and I did not argue with his son. I did not try to prove that they were wrong or that I was right. Not because I doubted the value of my experience, but because I understood that such a conversation would go nowhere. They believed what they believed, and I had no intention of turning the conference room into a place for defending personal positions. I continued to attend, I continued to listen, but I chose not to insert myself into decisions I no longer had the authority to make. I also did not send any long emails. I had seen many people do that in similar situations, writing messages filled with arguments, data, and restrained emotion. Most of those emails changed nothing and often made things more awkward. I did not want to leave behind a record of emotional resistance. If something needed to be clarified, I wanted it said directly, briefly, and on principle. During a meeting about responsibility assignments, when the discussion reached the question of who would carry final accountability for implementation decisions, I spoke. Once. I did not elaborate. I did not give examples. I did not reference the past. I asked one simple, principled question. Who would be responsible for decisions made when I no longer had signing authority? My tone was calm. There was no challenge in it, no demand for an apology. The room went quiet for a few seconds. No one answered right away. The CEO looked down at the papers in front of him. His son turned to his laptop screen. A few others avoided my eyes. Finally, the CEO said that responsibility would follow the new structure and that decisions would go through the appropriate management level. It was a correct organizational answer, and it confirmed exactly what I needed to know. I was no longer responsible for decisions I no longer had the authority to approve. I nodded and said nothing more. The question had done its job. There was no need to debate the answer. What mattered was that the boundary had been clearly defined, not emotionally, but structurally. When the meeting ended, I gathered my papers, stood up, and left the room like everyone else. No one stopped me, and I did not wait to be stopped. I walked down the familiar hallway at an even, unhurried pace. I was not rushing. I did not feel the need to speak to anyone right then. When I reached my office, I closed the door, pulled out my chair, and sat down. I did not turn on my computer. I did not open the email. I sat still, looking at the space in front of me, letting my thoughts settle in their own time. I did not display emotion. Not because I lacked it, but because I knew that letting it spill out in that moment would blur what mattered more. I was not angry. I was not sad, in the usual sense. I was thinking. I was reviewing what had happened, what was happening, and what was likely to happen next. In the quiet of that room, I felt the weight of the moment clearly, not as a shock, but as a necessary pause. I thought about responsibility, not in a broad moral sense, but in the very specific sense of the work I did. I could not be responsible for decisions I was not allowed to make. That was not just unfair to me, it was unfair to the system and to the people who depended on it. I also thought about authority and the relationship between authority and responsibility. Throughout my career, I had always believed the two had to move together. When they are separated, the risk does not stop with the individual affected. It spreads upward into the entire structure above them. I did not need to say that out loud. I only needed to acknowledge that the separation had already occurred. I sat there for a long time until the noise outside my office began to fade. Footsteps, brief conversations, the familiar sounds of a normal workday. I did not try to make a decision right then. I knew that important decisions should not be made in a reactive state. I needed time to think, to observe, and to understand my place within this new structure. From the outside, the moment would have looked unremarkable. Someone leaving a meeting, returning to their office, closing the door, and sitting quietly. But for me, it was the moment I began thinking most seriously about the path ahead, not as someone being pushed aside, but as someone who needed to redefine her own boundaries. A few days after that meeting, I continued coming to the office as usual. I did not take time off. I did not slow down my work. I did not behave differently. I handled what still fell within my scope, answered the questions that came my way, and kept my familiar routine. On the surface, nothing had changed. Inside, I was watching everything around me very closely. I paid attention to how new decisions were being made. I noticed the emails where I was copied for awareness, not for response. I noticed meetings where I was present but no longer guiding the discussion. Each small detail helped me understand the new structure the system was operating under. I did not rush to conclusions. I wanted to be certain that what I was sensing was not just a temporary reaction. In the evenings, when I got home, I sat quietly and thought, not to blame myself or dwell on regret, but to put everything in its proper place. I asked myself what truly felt wrong. It was not that I was no longer at the center of the project. It was not that someone else had been given an opportunity. What troubled me was the growing gap between the responsibility people still implicitly expected from me and the authority I actually held. I had done this work long enough to understand a simple principle. You cannot be responsible for decisions you are not allowed to make. In community healthcare, that principle is not just professional, it is ethical. When a wrong decision is made, the consequences do not stop at reports or budgets. They reach real people, people who have no choice but to trust the system. After a few days of reflection, I knew I could not remain in my current role without contradicting myself. Not because I lacked respect for the new leadership, but because I respected this work too much to do it halfway. I did not want to become someone kept on the sidelines, called in when problems surfaced, but without the authority to prevent those risks from the beginning. The decision to resign did not arrive as an impulse. It came quietly, after I had thought long enough to remove any doubt about my motivation. I opened my computer, created a new document, and began to write. I did not write much. I did not see the need. The most important things are often best said in very few words. In the letter, I did not criticize any individual. I did not mention who the project had been assigned to or which specific decisions had unsettled me. I stated one clear and honest reason. I could not continue to carry responsibility for a project over which I no longer had control or decision-making authority. I wrote it as a professional fact, not as a complaint. I reread the letter several times before sending it. I made only small adjustments for clarity. I wanted to be certain that my tone was calm and consistent. I did not want it read as an emotional reaction or as an attempt to apply pressure. I wanted it understood for what it was, a decision grounded in principle. When I pressed send, I did not feel relief or pain in the way people often describe leaving a long-held position. I felt clarity, clarity about my boundaries, clarity about what I could and could not accept. I knew this decision would have consequences, not just for me, but for the system as well. I also knew that staying in a structure where responsibility and authority no longer moved together would create even greater consequences. I did not announce my decision to many people right away. I did not arrange private conversations or seek reassurance. I let things move through the proper process. When a few close colleagues asked if I was certain, I simply said that I had thought very carefully. I did not elaborate. Those who understood, understood. My resignation was not a statement of protest. It was not a bid for attention. It was the only way I could remain consistent with what I believed and how I worked. Throughout my career, I had always believed that there are moments when you must say no, not because you are no longer capable, but because you are no longer in the right position to do what is right. When I left the office that day, I did not look back as if closing a chapter filled with regret. I looked forward, with the calm of someone who knew she had just made a difficult but necessary decision, not out of momentary emotion, but out of the principles she had lived by for more than 20 years. A few days after my resignation letter was sent, the system did not pause to reflect. Everything kept moving on the momentum of decisions already set in motion. I knew that would happen, and I also knew that the most dangerous moment for an organization often comes when it believes it has everything under control. At that point, the CEO was under pressure to prove that his changes were correct, fast, and effective to the board. This quarter. During those days, I heard from former colleagues that an important document was being rushed through faster than usual. It was the formal decision transferring full control of the modernization project to the CEO's son. The document required a final signature, and it was being pushed forward with a sense of urgency that was not even hidden. I was no longer in the position to receive drafts, but information still reached me through the quiet, familiar channels that exist when people observe in silence. Before the signature, warnings were sent out, not loudly, but clearly. A long-tenured manager who understood local relationships wrote an email outlining continuity risks. A funding partner suggested a brief pause for review. These messages were not confrontational. They were careful reminders. They arrived at the right time, but they were not given the attention they deserved because time pressure blurred judgment and diluted collective responsibility. The CEO chose to sign. I was told he said there was no time to wait. It was a familiar phrase, one that often appears when speed is expected to compensate for uncertainty. The decision was signed quickly, decisively, and framed as a necessary step forward. In that moment, the new structure was locked in, and the old connective threads were bypassed. No one stopped to ask what might break once reality began pushing back, slowly and without drama. The consequences arrived sooner than expected, though not explosively. Several contractors reached out asking for confirmation of points of contact. They needed to know who held final authority and who would be accountable if something went wrong. These were reasonable questions, ones I used to answer. This time, the questions circulated and response times stretched, signaling a lack of continuity in the newly formed decision chain that many could feel. Almost at the same time, the funding body requested a continuity review. It was not a red alert, but a yellow signal. They wanted assurance that the transition plan preserved accountability. These requests were standard, but their timing was sensitive. I knew those questions would not be easily answered by charts built on static data and assumptions about human behavior during constant change. None of these responses targeted any individual, but they exposed the weakness of the decision. When I later pieced it together, I saw no malice, only urgency, rationalized as leadership. Once the signature was in place, course correction became difficult. In governance, there are moments when you need to slow down. This was one of them. Instead, acceleration was chosen to meet reporting cycles and preserve confidence in front of a board and investors waiting for results. I call it the worst mistake, not because of immediate fallout, but because of its clear causality. A decision that ignored warnings led to questions, then delays, and eventually erosion of trust. The links formed naturally. No one had to sabotage anything. The system revealed its own vulnerability at the very moment it needed stability most, in the eyes of partners and the communities that had long placed their trust in it. Looking back, I understand why the decision was described as decisive in the boardroom. It satisfied short-term needs for authority and reporting. But speed does not replace continuity. In my work, continuity is the foundation. When the foundation is discounted, every improvement built above it becomes fragile against the smallest disruptions that reality inevitably delivers. That mistake did not need to be named loudly to be serious. It only needed to exist, and the consequences would follow. As I heard what unfolded next, I knew the rushed signature had created a turn that would be difficult to reverse. That is why I call it the worst mistake, not emotionally, but through years of observation working with fragile systems that depend on human trust more than anything else. The phone started ringing late one afternoon, just as I had left the house and was driving home after a long day. I glanced at the number and knew immediately who it was. I wasn't surprised. After everything that had happened, this call was inevitable. I didn't answer right away. I let it ring a few more times, long enough to be sure I wasn't reacting on instinct. Then I picked up. The CEO's voice on the other end no longer carried the familiar confidence I had heard in the conference room. He spoke faster than usual, asked if it was a good time to talk, then went straight to the point. He said the situation was more complicated than expected, that there were questions from partners and funders that needed to be addressed quickly. He mentioned my experience, my understanding of the system, and said he believed I could help steady things. He invited me to join an emergency meeting the following morning. His tone tried to stay even, but the urgency was unmistakable. I didn't interrupt. I didn't respond immediately. I let him finish, because I wanted to hear exactly how he framed the problem. When he paused, he added that leadership was prepared to ask me to come back and support the project, in a role better aligned with the new structure. That role, he explained, would not be one of full authority like before. I would not sign contracts or make final decisions. I would serve as a senior advisor, brought in when needed, helping transfer experience so the new team could operate more smoothly. He presented it as a reasonable compromise, a balance between innovation and stability. I listened carefully, not to find fault, but to understand precisely what was being offered. When he asked what I thought, I replied slowly. I thanked him for thinking of me and for the trust he said he placed in my experience. I said I understood the pressure he was under, and that I did not doubt his good faith in trying to find a solution. Then I declined. I didn't do it sharply or coldly. I declined politely, clearly, and without leaving any ambiguity. I said I could not return to a role where I was expected to carry the moral responsibility of the project without the corresponding authority to guide it and prevent risks from the start. I restated the boundary I had set when I resigned, not as a personal stance, but as a professional principle. There was a brief silence on the other end. The CEO didn't push back right away. He asked whether there was another way, whether I could be more flexible during this period. I told him that flexibility could not replace clarity. I didn't argue the details. I didn't offer conditions. I simply held my position, the same way I had from the beginning. During that conversation, there was a moment when I realized the roles had reversed. Before, I had been the one listening to decisions already made. This time, I was the one saying no, and my decision didn't require approval from any meeting. I didn't feel powerful, and I wasn't seeking that feeling. I only felt that I was standing where I needed to stand. Before ending the call, the CEO said he regretted that things had come to this. I told him I did as well. I said nothing more. After hanging up, I continued driving in silence, letting my thoughts pass without attaching myself to any emotion. There were a few more calls after that. From others in the system, people who said my presence could help stabilize things. I responded the same way each time: polite, brief, consistent. I didn't need to explain myself from the beginning again. The boundary had been set, and I had no intention of adjusting it because of temporary pressure. Some told me my experience was especially valuable right now. I agreed. But in my mind, a sentence echoed that I didn't need to say out loud. Experience only has value when it isn't used to patch the gaps left by rushed decisions. Experience is not a tool to slow things down, but it is also not something to call in after everything has already slipped out of control. When the phone finally stopped ringing, I knew I had done the only thing I could without betraying the principles that had guided my entire career. I hadn't closed the door in anger, and I hadn't reopened it through half measures. I had simply kept it in the right place, where responsibility and authority can stand next to each other without pretense. I was no longer inside the system when the decision to pause the project was made, but the news reached me quickly, the way important news always does, without any formal announcement. A former colleague called me early that morning, his voice low and tired. He said the modernization project had been put on hold for a comprehensive review. Not canceled, just paused. But in this world, a pause means everything begins to be examined far more closely. The State Health Board stepped in. They requested a review of the governance structure, project continuity, and especially how accountability had been assigned after the leadership change. The requests were not accusatory, but they carried the weight of oversight authority. Once the board is involved, there is no room for vague explanations or broad assurances. Everything has to be demonstrated through concrete processes and specific people. Clinics began to worry, not because they feared change, but because they feared disruption. For them, this project was not a plan on paper. It was patient schedules, equipment that needed replacing, and commitments that had already been made. When the project paused, their first question was not who was right or wrong. It was when stability would return. I heard that meetings began stacking up. Additional reports were requested. Questions that had never been asked before now became central. No one was shouting. No one was publicly assigning blame. The atmosphere was heavy but orderly, like a system realizing it needed to slow down before more fractures appeared. Of all the developments, the moment that stayed with me most involved the CEO's son. I was told he began to realize he was carrying a level of responsibility far beyond what he had imagined. Charts no longer answered real-world questions. Models did nothing to ease clinic anxiety. He was not criticized or humiliated. On the contrary, people tried to support him. But pressure cannot be divided evenly by goodwill. There was a meeting where he had to present to the board and partners. I heard that his voice trembled slightly in a few places, not from lack of preparation, but because, for the first time, he was facing consequences that had previously existed only on paper. It was not a personal failure, it was a first collision with his own limits, a limit everyone encounters at some point, differing only in timing and circumstance. The overall mood carried no sense of satisfaction. No one said this was deserved or inevitable. Most people were focused on minimizing damage and restoring stability. When a system that serves a community falters, there is no room for triumph, only responsibility and consequence. I observed everything from the outside, with enough distance not to be pulled back in, but close enough to understand what was happening. I did not feel right in a way that made others wrong. I saw a chain of decisions leading to their natural outcome. No explosion, no dramatic collapse, just a forced slowdown, like a body that must rest after being pushed too far. This unraveling did not need tragedy to be real. It showed itself in longer phone calls, in meetings without certainty, in the worried eyes of people accustomed to stability. It was a reminder that in complex systems, mistakes rarely arrive as a single blow. They emerge gradually through decisions that seem reasonable until everything is forced to stop and breathe. When I think about all of it, I do not feel relief or sorrow. I feel a quiet confirmation that the boundaries I set were not rigid without reason. They exist to prevent situations like this, where people are placed into roles they are not yet ready for, and the entire system pays the price for that urgency. After the project was paused and the system entered a review phase, I was no longer directly involved in any decisions there. My life slowed down in a very natural way, not because I lacked work, but because I was no longer reacting to crises created by others. A smaller nonprofit reached out through an old connection. They worked in rural healthcare support, quietly, without glossy reports or loud claims, but with real practical impact. I agreed to join as a part-time advisor. No big title, no large team to manage. The work moved at a completely different pace. There were no hours-long meetings spent negotiating wording, no presentations endlessly revised to match shifting management preferences. Instead, there were short, direct conversations focused on how to keep a clinic stable for another year, or how to make sure a small grant was used where it actually mattered. I found myself returning to the values that had led me down this path in the first place. One ordinary morning, I drove through a small town on the way to my first appointment in this new role. Familiar road, low trees, an old clinic on a corner. I had worked with that place years earlier. The building had not changed much. The sign was slightly faded, but the doors were open and staff cars were parked out front. I slowed down, glanced through the window, and realized that good decisions rarely create dramatic moments. They simply allow things to continue. I did not stop the car. I kept driving, with a quiet sense of relief that did not need a name. I knew I had chosen correctly, not because of what had happened to my former organization, but because of what no longer happened to me. I no longer had to explain why authority is necessary to carry responsibility. I no longer stood between decisions I was not allowed to shape. I could do my work fully, even at a smaller scale, even without attention. From time to time, I still hear news from the old system, not because I am following it, but because long-established relationships do not disappear with a resignation letter. Things have slowly stabilized in their own way, not quickly, not perfectly, but enough to move forward. My name no longer appears in new reports, and that is fine. I do not need credit to know what I contributed, and I do not need proof that I was right. Over time, I have come to understand that leaving the right way is not about slamming a door shut. It is about stepping away without carrying resentment. I did not leave so that someone else would fail. I left because there are boundaries that, once crossed, make it impossible to recognize yourself in the work you do. A career is not measured only by what you achieve, but also by what you refuse to accept. That afternoon, after finishing the last meeting of the day, I sat alone in the small office of the new organization. No sweeping view, no large conference table, just a wooden desk and a window facing the parking lot. I realized I needed nothing more. The quiet was not emptiness, it was space to breathe. I did not write another letter. I did not make a statement about what had passed. I let things remain where they belonged. Some stories do not need a dramatic ending. They need to be told with clarity and steadiness, the way someone moves forward without looking back. I believe there is a simple principle that is difficult to hold on to. You should only accept responsibility when you have the authority to do what is right. When that principle is broken, leaving is not failure. It is the necessary choice. If you value stories told slowly, with depth, and without needing to shout for attention, you can subscribe to this channel. Here, we tell stories like that, not to prove who was right or wrong, but to remind us that sometimes how you leave matters just as much as how you stay.